Hi guys! So today I am going to be doing my October wrap-up. I read 10 books in October, which is the most I've read in quite a while. Some of the books are pretty short, so it's not quite as good as it sounds, but I'm still pretty happy with how much I read. I am just going to side note that I'm filming this video at night, which I don't normally do, so my makeup is not looking nearly as good as it did when I first did it this morning, so just a side note. Anyways, on to the wrap-up. Since I do have 10 books to talk about, I'm not going to be going too in-depth about them, but yeah. Anyways, let's just get started. So the first book that I read was Fiendish by Brenna Jovanoff. This is a YA thriller slash supernatural paranormal kind of book. It follows a girl called Clementine, and when she was 7, she was locked away inside the wall of her basement in this like sleeping state, and so this story follows her 9 years later when she's found and she's trying to figure out who put her there and why. I had a really hard time coming up with a final rating for this book. It was kind of all over the place for me. I started off really liking it, then I really didn't like it, then I really liked it, and then it was just kind of average for the last 150 pages. So in the end I settled on 3.5 stars. So I'd never read a book by this author before, but in the first chapter, or I think it was like the prologue, I noticed straight away how much I loved the writing and the world building, just like the descriptions of everything. This world reminded me of a very like Tim Burton-esque kind of world, you know, in like The Corpse Bride or Sweeney Todd, where everything is very gray toned. That's just how I pictured everything in this world, and the writing was just absolutely beautiful. The main problems that I had with this book were the characters and the plot. The problem I had with the plot, it was for the most part pretty interesting, but I just found that things were too easy and like too convenient. One of the things that really bothered me, which I'm sure there was probably some kind of explanation for it, but one of the things was that if you were locked away when you're 7 years old, having no human interaction for 9 years, like Clementine comes out and she is like continues living the life of this 16-year-old, even though she hasn't had any kind of human interaction since she was 7. And I feel like realistically, despite the fact that this is like a supernatural paranormal book, I feel like realistically you would still kind of have a younger mindset, like the mind of a child, if you haven't interacted with people for 9 years. Just my personal opinion, and that was something that really bothered me about this book, because she comes out of this wall in her basement and just seems like she lives the life of a normal 16-year-old. I mean, like, acts like a normal 16-year-old. So that just kind of bothered me. Also, the characters, I just didn't feel anything for them. Honestly, I don't even think I could remember any of their names except for the main character, so yeah, they just didn't leave any kind of lasting impression, which is a big problem for me because I'm definitely a character-driven reader, so yeah. Next I read How to Hang a Witch by Adriana Mather. This book follows a girl called Sam, and her stepmom are moving from New York City to Salem, Massachusetts. Sam's dad is in a coma, so I guess they just can't really afford to live in New York City anymore, so they're moving to Salem, Massachusetts to live in the house that Sam's dad grew up in. But Sam is actually a descendant of Cotton Mather, who was one of the men responsible for the Salem witch trials, so she very quickly becomes the enemy of these group of kids at the high school there who call themselves the Descendants, and they are the descendants of the people who were killed during the Salem witch trials. Also, fun fact, the author is actually a descendant of Cotton Mather. So I gave this book a 3.75 out of 5 stars. I quite enjoyed it. The Salem witch trials seems like something that would be right up my alley, like as creepy as that sounds, but I actually realized that I didn't know a whole lot about the Salem witch trials until I read this book, and I found myself researching. I like read the Wikipedia page and watched some YouTube videos about it, but now I know a lot more than I knew going into this book. So I really enjoyed that whole aspect of the story and the plot. As far as the characters go, I liked the characters. I especially liked Elijah, if you've read the book, and the main character is a little bit annoying, and I can definitely see how she would be very annoying to anybody else reading this. She was kind of like an aggressive character. One of the things was that she would very easily like snap at people or get very like just like aggressive with people, I guess. I think it would have been better if it was told in third person instead of first person, because it was a bit annoying being inside her head the whole time, but I didn't hate her character by any means. The only other problem I had with this book was the ending. I found it a little bit difficult to keep up with what was happening just with the way it was written, and I also just wasn't 100% satisfied with how it ended. This is the first book in a series, but I don't really think the storylines are related because this book is about the Salem witch trials and the second book is about Titanic. I'm very interested to see how they're going to connect those, but yeah, I think they kind of follow different stories while still following the same characters. Next book that I read was This Is Our Story by Ashley Elston, and I actually did a full video review for this, so if you want to learn more about this book and my thoughts on it, you can click the link up in the corner, but I gave this book 4 out of 5 stars. Next I read The Aviary by Kathleen Odell. This is a middle grade historical fiction fantasy kind of book. So this book follows a girl called Clara, and she lives in this big house that's owned by this older woman, and Clara's mom is kind of like the caretaker for this woman. And in the backyard there is this aviary with just a few birds in it that are very strange, and one day they say the name Elliot, I believe it was. I read this at the very beginning of the month, so I'm having a little bit of a hard time recalling all the details, but I believe he says the name Elliot, and this leads Clara to try to find out what happened to these kids that used to live in the house. So I gave this book 3.75 out of 5 stars. I quite enjoyed it, even though it was a middle grade, which usually isn't my thing. It is on the more creepier side of middle grade, which I definitely do tend to enjoy more. Overall, this was just a beautiful book. I loved the writing, the characters were so sweet, I especially loved Ruby, and it's just this really adorable, slightly sad story. Really the only reason I didn't give it a higher rating was just because it is middle grade, so it's a little bit harder for me to connect with the characters, which is something that's very important for me with reading. Just for that reason, the like entertainment level of it was a little bit lower, which is what I base my ratings off of. But other than that, it was a really beautiful story. The only other thing that I think is worth mentioning is that it is historical fiction, but I had a really hard time trying to figure out when exactly it took place. I want to say it was like the early 1900s, but like I'm not very good at history and time and stuff like that, so I don't really know. The next book that I read was Coraline by Neil Gaiman. This is actually a reread for me. This is also a middle grade, but it is one of those creepier ones, so it is more up my alley. I've spoken about this book a lot on my channel, so I'm not going to explain the synopsis again because I just feel like I'm repeating myself, but I'm sure most of you probably heard of this book before and what it's about. But this was a reread for me, and the first time I read it, I gave it 4 stars, and when I read it again this year, I gave it 4 stars again, but I can't say that my time reading it this time around was particularly enjoyable, but that had nothing to do with the book or the story or anything like that. It was just because I was reading it for a readathon, and it was the last day of the readathon. I had to finish this in like an afternoon, and I ended up getting a really bad headache, so I was like forcing myself to read it, which is not a good idea. I probably should have just put it down. But yeah, so this time around it wasn't particularly enjoyable to read, but that had nothing to do with the story. Next I read Daughter of Smoke and Bone by Laini Taylor, and I have been dreading trying to explain the plot of this story, so if you want a proper synopsis, you can go look it up on Goodreads, but basically it's like a demons and angel forbidden love story. I gave this book 3.5 out of 5 stars. I had a lot of trouble with this book. It's one that I think I had very high expectations for because a lot of people love this book, and it just didn't meet my expectations. The biggest problem I had with it was that I found myself being very confused, not like in the current points that were happening, like I wasn't confused as to what was happening in the present. It was just like in the grand scheme of things I didn't understand what was going on, and I understand that there is a point to that because the main character doesn't really know what's going on, so obviously the reader won't, but I just I wanted to know what was happening because I just felt like all this stuff is going on and I don't know what's happening. I've said that so many times now, but that's basically my biggest problem that I had with this book. I also just didn't really connect with the characters at all. I mean, they were okay, I liked them, but they didn't leave any kind of long-lasting impression. I tried to read the second book, and I ended up DNFing it like 200 pages in, which I was very shocked that I let myself go on that long because I don't like to DNF books more than 100 pages in, but it was a 500-page book, so I just didn't I just didn't want to read it anymore, so I DNF'd it, and I won't be continuing on with the series. Also, for some reason, I just did not get on with this writing. I don't know why. I've heard a lot of people say that it's very beautiful, and I could totally see how that is, but for some reason, that just made it harder for me to read it, and I found that it was taking me longer to get through because I was having to focus on the writing a lot more. Next, I read Idiosyncratic by Britt Noons. This was sent to me in exchange for an honest review from the author, so if you want to learn more about this book and my thoughts on it, I will leave a link to it up in the corner. Then I read A Madness So Discreet by Mindy McGinnis. This is a historical fiction book that follows a girl called Grace, and she was put in an insane asylum by her father, and she catches the eye of a doctor there, and he realizes that she is not crazy and that she's actually very good at noticing things about people and stuff like that the average person wouldn't catch. So him and her team up to try and solve these string of murders that are happening at another asylum. Sorry about the glare on these books, by the way. I'm having to hold them at like a very awkward angle, but they're all library copies, so they're very reflective. But I ended up giving this book 2.5 out of 5 stars. Unfortunately, it was another kind of disappointing read. The biggest problems I had with this book was that it felt very slow paced, which I wasn't expecting because it sounds like a thriller crime novel set in an asylum. I figured it would be fast paced because usually, crime thriller novels like that are. But this one wasn't, so it took me quite a while to get through. I also just wasn't a fan of the main character, not for any particular reason, I just didn't really like her that much. I did, however, really like Dr. Thornhollow. He reminded me of a very, Sherlock character, so I really liked him. He was very funny and witty and clever, and so that is why I did give it an extra 0.5 stars. And also, they were just the humor in this book was very funny, and there were a couple times where I did actually laugh. I just wish it would have been a little bit more fast-paced, and the plot just in general, I felt like it wasn't that exciting. I don't want to spoil anything, but I thought it was going to be a very creepy read, set in this 1800 insane asylum where they didn't treat patients very well, and it started off like that, but then they went to another asylum, and if I was ever to be put in an insane asylum, I'd hope it'd be that one because it seemed not that bad. So that whole kind of creepy insane asylum aspect just wasn't really a part of it anymore. So yeah, I was just kind of disappointed with the plot and the pacing. Next, I read The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson, and I read it as a part of this big anthology of Penny Dreadfuls, which is heavy, so I'm gonna put it down. I assume most people probably know what Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is about. It's a pretty short story, so if you don't know what it's about, I wouldn't really know how to explain it to you anyway without spoiling the ending. But I was pleasantly surprised with this book. I don't normally like classics, mostly because of the writing. It's usually very dense, and the whole old world English is just very hard for me to understand. But I gave this one 4 out of 5 stars. I really enjoyed it, and the writing was surprisingly easy to follow. I do think the plot definitely helped as well with me being interested in reading it because it is more of that gothic horror kind of story, and I've been reading a lot of Jane Austen, which is romance, which has never really been a favorite genre for me, so I'm sure that definitely doesn't help with reading those kinds of books with that kind of writing. But yeah, overall I was pleasantly surprised with Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. The final book that I read in October was actually a short story by Agatha Christie. It was called Philomel Cottage, or Philomel Cottage, I don't really know how to pronounce it. I read it as a part of this very old and tiny anthology that was called The World's Best 100 Detective Stories, Volume 4. The book was only about 40 pages, so I can't really tell you much about the plot without spoiling half the book, but it was a very good mystery story. Agatha Christie never fails to disappoint. I have only read 3 of her books, but still they've all been really high ratings. I gave this one 4 stars. I don't know if I mentioned that already. I really need to read more Agatha Christie because her stories are just so gripping and you just want to keep reading and reading and reading. There was even, after this story, there was another short story by Agatha Christie, and I so nearly just kept on reading and read the next story, but I decided to hold off and read it in November. So yeah, those were all of the books that I read in October. Leave me a comment down below and let me know what your favorite book was that you read in October. Mine was honestly probably the Agatha Christie book. It was very good. Despite reading 10 books, I did have a pretty mediocre reading month. Most of them were 3-star reads. I actually did do a whole discussion Coco conversation video on why I haven't really been enjoying the books I've been reading lately. So if you want to watch that, I will leave a link to it up in the corner. And yeah, that is all for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you in my next one. Bye!